Namaste. Welcome to this podcast. Insight UK is a social movement dedicated to raising awareness, advocating, and campaigning for the cause that concerns and impact British Hindus and Indian communities in the United Kingdom. In Insight, we conduct research studies, survey, camping, seminars, and advocacy initiative, alongside engaging with various stakeholders in the society to further these causes, such as raising awareness, advocating, and campaigning against anti-Hindu, anti-India hate and propaganda. Today, we are very fortunate to have Mr. Prajña with us. He's changed to Sanatana Dharma, and then his interview will be taken by Anandiji. So before I sign off, I would request Anandiji to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Priyanka-ji. Namaste, everyone. My name is Anandi, and welcome to Insights UK's new podcast series where we interview Sanatanis and people who have embraced Hindu Dharma, but who have come from a non-Sanatani or non-Indic background. We will talk to them about how their journeys into Sanatana Dharma have come about and how their lives have changed as a result. For our very first podcast, we are very delighted to welcome Prajña-ji. He is known as Trad Yogi on his Instagram page, if some of you have come across his page to begin with. He is a yoga and meditation practitioner and teacher who has clarified on his YouTube channel. You can see that we've done some research on you, that his classes are 100% devoid of new age jargon. So very interesting to see that. He also regales us with connections between the ancient Norse pagan and Sanatani cultures, and clearly demonstrates his devotion to Sanatana Dharma with posts containing Sanskrit quotes from the scriptures. So namaste and swagatam, Prajña-ji. A very warm welcome to the podcast.
Abhariho Anandiji. Thank you. Fun to be here.
Great. Thank you again for joining us. Let's just dive right in. First of all, could you please tell us a bit more about yourself, your background, where you grew up?
Yeah, I am Norwegian by birth, and I still live here, still work here. I first encountered yoga when I was about 13 or 14, and felt a very strong connection to it immediately, and also to the Sanskrit language. I remember like hearing the sound of Sanskrit and always having this sort of almost strange ease of understanding Sanatani ideas and darshan, and this weird sense of ease in understanding the concepts of yoga, of Samkhya, of Vedanta in general. And been to India quite a few times after I became old enough to travel. Love the country a lot, and been practicing a variety of different sadhanas and within a variety of different traditions. And as you say, I'm very, very concerned by propagating the connection between the indigenous European spiritual traditions and Sanatana Dharma, because it is the same tradition expressed differently, but if you go into the myths in detail, you see that this is the same mythology expressed differently. It's the same Dharma expressed differently. So that's something I also work with. So in addition to teaching yoga and jhana, I also work as a lecturer with Norse tradition, where we are trying to promulgate the connection that the Norse indigenous spirituality have to the rest of European indigenous spiritual traditions, but also very strongly to Sanatana Dharma. Because if you go into the details of the mythologies, I'll just take an example to get us started, that most people from the Marvel movies probably know Thor, the Norse god, right? And Thor has the hammer, and Thor controls lightning and rain. And if you then go to the Vedas, you have a very interesting deity that parallels Thor quite good, which is Indra. Indra is the holder of the Vajra, which is the lightning scepter. Indra is the god of rain. Indra also conquers Vritra, like the serpent that takes away the water from the world, and he therefore saves humanity, which is exactly paralleled in the Norse myth of Thor fighting the giant serpent. And if you go to, I'll just take a random example, but if you go to Greece, you have the history, for example, of Perseus, a Greek hero fighting the Hydra, right to water dragon. So you have all of these parallels, which I found when I started to dive into this. I found it extremely interesting, and almost as if I had been sort of robbed of a part of my history and identity I didn't know about, like the Indo-European connection, the Aryan connection. So after that, I've just been keep diving into that, and in that sense as well, it feels not as if I'm practicing or devoting myself to a alien kind of spiritual tradition, but more like a coming home, because India and Hindu Dharma is to this day the only unbroken tradition we have of this original Aryan spirituality. India is the only place where we can sort of go to if we want to understand, okay, so if we want to revert back from the monotheistic Semitic religions and go back to the source, how would it look like today? How would that look like? India is the example of how that would look like today.
Wow, brilliant. I'm glad you touched upon the similarities between the Vedic deities and Norse deities. We'll be going into more of the similarities between the two cultures a bit later on. So you mentioned that you initially just felt this sort of affinity for the language and for the culture. So I guess that just sort of segues into my next question of how did you begin your journey into Sanatana Dharma and being a Sanatani?
Through yoga. And then of course you have the issue of how yoga is taught in the West, which is one of the things I spend most of my time advocating against or trying to clarify, because it waters down something to a huge extent. But I came into it first through yoga, and then by following. I'm a very traditionally minded man, and I always want to go to the source of something. So first through yoga, but then after that through pursuing the actual Vedic corpus of literature. So starting from the Puranas to Upanishads, and then working back to the Vedas themselves, and actually studying the core texts and the core ideas.
Right. Were you a self-taught yoga practitioner, or did you attend formal classes or instruction?
I attended formal classes, but then again, the issue there is in the West that yoga is physical fitness, right?
Mm.
So I'm going to start a little bit of a rant here, but like the word in and of itself, if you go to the original Vedic, the Sanskrit sources, you won't see the word used in the different, like what is described as yoga in the West would be called asana, right? Just like simply practicing positions. And if you go to I'm referring here to the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Shiva Samhita, and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. If you go to those core texts of yoga, you will never see asana practice described as it is practiced in the West. Asana practice is something you do in order to perform pranayama and gyan better, right? So yes, I've attended loads of formal classes in the West, but my main spiritual, call it education, comes from initially from going back to the original Indian sources, the original Sanskrit literature, which we're lucky to have. Yeah, and it's also something I keep referring the people I teach yoga to, because they're asking where can I read more about this, and I try to always refer people back to the source texts on yoga and meditation, because they're also really great sources, which is very fascinating. Because if you pick up a New Age book about meditation, you will get all of this. Take a bath, take some time for yourself, connect to your higher. It's all of this very abstract language that doesn't say anything concrete. It's very abstract, it's very fluffy, and it's a very stark contrast to the Indian core texts, which are extremely precise in their language. They're very scientific and they're very precise in what they're telling you to do. So I find that also very interesting. I find the Indian sources, even though they're from the Middle Ages, to be much more precise and better pedagogical tools than the modern Western pedagogy around yoga and meditation.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. I'm really glad that you have touched on the authenticity of the text and being able to refer to that more than what's called what you have referred to as New Age jargon. And I'm glad again that you've touched upon that, because we'll be discussing that a little more in detail a bit later on. Just also want to ask you, when you became a fully fledged Sanatani, when it was apparent as to where your personal journey was heading, how did others around you react? Did it alienate? Did it attract criticism? Or was it the complete opposite and people embraced your newfound, shall we say, way of life? or newly discovered way of life?
Well, among friends and family, they're used to me being a bit weird and eccentric, so no problem there at all. I think most of the backlash I have been facing, but that's more in terms of like my online digital presence, is from the Western yoga community. Because of I'm quite uncompromising with the way I teach and my insistence upon following certain traditional elements when you're teaching yoga. So, and of course in the West as well, within the yoga community, people are a bit averse to the whole spiritual side of things. So I think most of the frictions in my Sanatani practice and function has more been from that side of things. Yeah,
That's quite astonishing to hear that you found criticism in the Western yoga practitioners who you would think would be more willing to embrace what you're all about, your personality. So that's quite astonishing. Again, we'll kind of go into that in a bit more detail later on. So just to kind of on a different side, on your Instagram page, profile, you've created content about the similarities between the Norse and Sanatani cultures and civilizations. So here's what I'm going to ask you. Could you please elaborate and explain for our viewers and listeners the connection between the two? So just maybe just in a bit more detail of what you found.
right. So both the Sanatani culture and the Norse culture are derivations of the original Aryan culture. So historically, the original Aryan culture existed on the steppes of modern-day Ukraine. It was a nomadic culture, very, very centered around the cow as an animal, and also centered around the warrior ethos, if you will, very centered around the warrior culture and around the cow as an animal. Now, that culture was, there's no way to say this without being blunt, it was a military superior culture to everything else that existed in the world at that time. It was also a technologically superior culture. They were the first people that developed the spoked wheel, the war chariot, and most importantly, the first European culture that developed lactoid persistence, right? The ability to digest the enzyme of milk. Now, what you have there with the milk, the part the milk plays in the culture, which you see very, very visibly in modern day the Indian reverence for Magai, is that lactoid persistence allowed that culture to train very strong warriors from a very, very early age, which allowed them to have a military capacity that didn't look like anything else in the world at that time. That culture later then expanded, and then there are still discussions about how military was that migration really. People don't really know. But at some point, that culture spread down into India through the Hindu Kush mountains, down into the north of India, and into Europe as well, in these like great waves of migration. And they brought their culture, their mythology, and their customs with them. Right. So going a little bit back to the cow, for example, to take that as a simple, in the Norse creation myth, the entire universe starts with a cow, and the cow is seen as a sort of symbol of life. Milk is seen as a symbol of life, which is again striking parallel to the Indian culture and the reverence and the place the cow holds in the culture as a giver of life, namely because in that original Aryan culture, the cow was the lifeline for all of the people. There were nomadic herders. Like now we're talking a really, really, really long time ago, just so that it's said. So like we don't know a lot of precise things about this culture, but we see the echoes of the original Indo-European culture all over the world. So that's one example. Then of course our languages are similar. They're Indo-European or Aryan languages, and the similarities between modern day Norwegian and Hindi are so strong that it's like you really hear that this is coming from the same place. Like in Norwegian, if I am to say my name is, I'm sorry. So if I say my name is, it's mitt navn er, and in Hindi it's mera naam hai. And you hear the similarities in these languages as well. So you still see this connection between the cultures. And then, of course, in the mythology, you have these very, very strong parallels in the Hindu mythology, the Greek mythology, the Old Norse mythology. You guys have the Vedas, we have the Eddas. Another very strong part of this Indo-European proto-culture is that language is seen as a sacred thing, and language is seen as sort of when the gods breathe the spirit of life into mankind, when they transfer the prana, they also transfer the ability to use language, right? And you see that in the Norse sources, our god Odin, our chief deity Odin, he finds the runes, the symbols of speech, the magical speech that he uses to fight the forces of chaos. I'm rambling a bit right now, but that's also an important element that in the Aryan spirituality, in Sanatana Dharma, in the Norse spirituality, you see that the division is not really between like good and evil or pure and impure, which you see very strongly in the Semitic religions, but the division is between the forces of order and the forces of chaos. The god, the devas, are the forces of order. They're the ones that create order so that the universe can be harmonious. They established what the Vedas refers to as Rita, which later became karma, or the term karma replaced Rita, kind of. And in the Norse, we have the concept of Urd. So Urd in Old Norse and Rita also come from the same word. So the gods are, in the Indo-European spiritualities, the gods are the upholders and the creators of order, and their weapon in their fight against the Titans or the Jotun in the Norse world or the Asuras is Vakteri. It's the sacred speech is what they use, which I find to be a very interesting. So language has a very big part in this culture. It's something you see in the Sanskrit text, that sort of like elevation of the sacred language. Like language is seen as something that in and of itself creates harmony and creates meaning. And the psychology of that is also really interesting, because when the two of us are talking right now, Anandaji, we are sort of like through our words creating a shared universe, right? So that's words establish that harmony, because through our words and through the way we speak, we create our reality. We sort of project our spirit onto reality by our words and through language. Because like, you can have a difference. Somebody might, it's both like an inner dialogue and an outer dialogue, right? Because it's the way you speak to others, but that way you speak to others is just a manifestation of how you speak to yourself, or how you speak to yourself about the world. And you have external experiences, right? But then you have what the yoga called the chittamritti, or the samskara, the internal projections around external circumstance. And somebody is late to the bus, for example, the bus leaves, and then you have two different people. One of the first one will speak to himself and say, this always happens to me, I'm always unlucky, my life is always right. And the other person will say, this is great, now I have some extra time to meditate, I have some extra time to go for a walk. This is like, so there's really no direct causality between external circumstance and inner state. This is one of the core messages of yoga, that we have control of the inner state, and that the way that we purify and make sure that external circumstances don't have a bearing on our inner state is through language, is through how we conceptualize the world around us, and is through how we speak to other people. And this reverence for language as a magical tool, the Vakdevi, or the runes as we call them, is also something you see in this original Indo-European culture, that the gods create reality through mantra. And if you go back to the original Vedic texts as well, you see that they are very, very concerned about saying the right things, about like how precisely is this ritual chant, and you still have the chants are a very big part of it, because language is seen as that, which it precisely is. Like we all know that like words can instigate violence, or words can facilitate peace. So words have that power, and you see that in the old Roman religion, which again is an Aryan Indo-European religion. You also see that you had like a specific class of priests whose only purpose was to know the correct words to say. So those are some similarities. Again, this is something I could probably talk about for 8 hours straight. But if there are, and of course as well the caste system, which is a very strong Indo-European connection. You see, like the Old Norse had a caste system. There is the Varna system in India. There was the old Roman caste system. So this culture also had a very strong emphasis on a caste system, not necessarily as a mode of oppression originally, but more by sort of picturing that the human society is like a body, and certain people are born with a certain, what we in Sanskrit would call karma. people are born with a certain like a certain role they're supposed to play in the fabric of the universe, if you will. So yeah, that's another similarity that is important to bring up.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Thanks for elucidating that for our audience. And I get the feeling that we've only touched the surface. And like you said, you could go on speaking about this for a very long time. There's more to unpack, I'm sure. But thanks so much for clarifying that for our audience. Now, I'd like to ask you about the fact that I think we can sort of see an emerging pattern of the Western societies seeing a revival or some kind of a return to their culture or society's ancient pagan roots or indigenous way of life. There is at the very least a detachment from the Abrahamic faith groups. Do you see that in your own country? Are you seeing this sort of detachment away from the country's main religion, so to speak, or at least to some kind of a turning into the pagan system, yoga or meditation, or some kind of an interest in the Eastern ways of life? Do you see that?
Yes, definitely. There are two factors here. There's one, there is a big interest for the Eastern spiritual systems. It has been like that in the West for a few decades now. But there is simultaneously a turning back to more pagan roots. We see that especially in Norway, that there are a lot of people who are attending these pagan-inspired events, and I don't know how it is in the UK, but Christianity has no power in Norway anymore. People are turning more and more away from it. And I think not necessarily because it's a bad religion per se, but it's just alien. It's not a part of us. It's not who we are. We've been Christian for quite a long time, but at the end of the day, the Abrahamic religions are strange, and they're not really a part of the Indo-European spirit, because these religions are massively centered around the idea of victimhood, right? They're very centered around the idea of being a hopeless supplicant to a power far beyond you, right? God is removed from the world. It's a very strong idea. God is removed from the world. Whereas in the Indo-European faiths, in Sanatana Dharma, in the Norse faith, the gods, the divine, is something that is imminent. It's something that's around you. The world is not a sinful place full of like dangers that might trick you into eternal damnation, but quite on the contrary, the world is the Shakti of God, right? The world is the manifestation of the divine power of God, and is thus a witness to the intelligence and to the love of the creative force, right? And which I think is a much more positive way of orienting yourself in the world, rather than, and like, of course, I'm joking a little bit around the Semitic and the Abrahamic religions, but I find them a bit, they're a bit bleak. It's not a lot of fun, and there's not a lot of things you can do yourself. Everything is mediated by these external agents. So yeah. But summing up, yeah, I definitely see it turning back to, and a great curiosity for our pre-Christian pagan civilization, with all that entails.
Thank you. Yes, what a beautiful explanation. And I hope that we can see more individuals in Western societies reverting back to the ancient ways of life and ancient practices. I think it will do everyone a whole world of good. Now, I'd like to ask you about this return to an ancient pagan way of life, ancient indigenous way of life. Do you find at the same time, simultaneously, that there is more of a pivot towards, and we talked about this just a little bit earlier, towards what we might call a pseudo-pagan identity, where it's just about some kind of a revert to this so-called New Age culture, such as crystals, cards, astrology, witchcraft, etc. Of course, some of those can have a deeper meaning, and I think there are more sort of profound meanings to their origins, and maybe that's been distorted over time. I don't know. But do you feel that where we are seeing this return to an ancient indigenous way of life, are we at the same time seeing a pivot towards what is this kind of pseudo-pagan identity? And how do you feel about that? And how do you feel that you can sort of counter that, shall we say?
Definitely, that is a danger. There are several dimensions to what you're asking here, and one thing, of course, is the capitalization of spirituality, right? It's a capitalization of spirituality. But the modern world is a world without identity. This is one of the biggest problems that people have in the modern world. They don't know who they are because they can choose their identity to a large extent. So identity now has become something we can choose. We can choose which groups we belong to. We can choose all of those things. That's also important to remember that in a traditional pagan society, you didn't choose your religion, right? So religion and spirituality has been something that people shop in the same way we shop clothes, right? Because everything is available, the world is globalized. So you can try yoga for a few weeks, you can try Buddhism for a few weeks, you can try a little bit of paganism here. So people are very trained in this kind of mentality. And the danger of that kind of mentality is that you never go into something in depth and you never pursue anything to the extent that it challenges your ego and therefore creates a potential for transformation. So this is something we do. We do it with the Netflix. We watch 5 minutes of this, 5 minutes of that. We do it with people with the Tinder. This one for 2 weeks, that one for 2 weeks. So the entire culture around us, the modern culture, trains us to orient ourselves or to treat the world not as an individual with a responsibility, but as a consumer, right? Where everything is about us, everything is about our pleasure. This is a big problem, and it's not a problem that can be solved externally. It needs to be, it's a very deep down cultural issue that needs to be solved culturally, right? This is a big problem. I don't necessarily think that we will see this problem solved in our way of life, but when we are training people to orient themselves as consumers in a world of products, right? So spirituality becomes a product, and if the customer is always right, so when you encounter something in yoga, for example, you don't like, you just change to Jainism or Taoism or whatever suits you better, right? So we need to do something about that attitude in and of itself in order to do something about the symptoms of that attitude and the symptoms of that consumerist mindset. Yes, we see it in religion, but we also see it in relationships. We see it in families. We see it in groups of friends. So this is a dragon with a lot of heads. I don't know if that's really good answer to your question, but I wholeheartedly agree that with the reversion back to more traditional spiritual systems, there is simultaneously a great danger, and people need to ask themselves, why am I doing this? Is it for me, or is it for other beings, right? Because I think that's the distinction between traditional spiritual systems and New Age jargon, is that what is the motivation for doing it? Is it to make yourself look cool and edgy and get attention, and so you can go to the raves and wear malas and stuff like that? Or is it because you actually look at yourself and you think, I want to be a better human being, I want to be a better partner, I want to develop kindness within myself, I want to develop truthfulness? With that motivation, like with the bhakta, then with that sort of inner love, inner compassion, inner humility, then everything you touch changes. It sort of transforms the world around you. But if the attitude, on the other hand, is that you're bored of yourself, you're bored of the people around you, you're running away from your responsibilities, your dharma, then everything around you turns to poison. So it's like something everyone has to ask themselves, like, what is my motivation for doing this, right? And it all goes back to compassion, to karuna. If the motivation is that I want to offer a more enlightened, loving relationship to the people around me, to the world, this is something I very often tell my yoga students, that like, you shouldn't care about how advanced your asana looks or how long you can keep this position. You should care about your motivation for doing the practice. And if you have two people, one of the two people, he's doing super advanced yoga poses and standing on his head and blah blah blah, but his motivation is to become more strong, more attractive, to identify as a good yogi, and you have somebody else barely able to move their bodies, but their motivation is that I want to serve living beings, then that person is the superior yogi, right?
Absolutely. Do you find that this kind of pseudo New Age identity trivializes the movement towards indigenous spiritual systems? Does it sort of, how do you feel about that? Does it kind of deviate from the true meaning of what these cultures were espousing?
Absolutely, because the new age spirituality is solely about ego. It's about manifesting your dream partner, manifesting your dream job. It's only about the ego. It's a consumerism wrapped in a more shiny paper, right? These books, like, because like if you, okay, so let's take an example. You'll find these books and online courses and everything about how you can manifest more money, manifest a better partner, manifest, right? About like attracting these things around you. Let me contrast that to the yama and yamas of yoga, the ethical discipline of yoga, where you have santosh, which is one of the most important things, which means accepting your circumstances and doing the best from where you are in the world, rather than complaining and trying to pull more things towards you. So the difference couldn't be any clearer. The difference couldn't be any starker, you know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Now, just going a little bit away from that, what do you feel are the misconceptions about ancient Norse culture, which, as we mentioned, is something that you frequently post content about on social media? We've already discussed this a little bit as well during the podcast. So, what do you feel are the ways in which people have misconceptions about your ancient way of life, your ancient system? How would you like to
Well,
respond to that?
there are many misconceptions. Let me take the most important ones, because when the Vikings encountered the rest of Europe, like the North was the last place to be Christianized, right? So the Northerners, the Vikings, were pagans, which created an incentive for the European mainline to paint these people as more barbaric than what they actually were, right? One thing is that it's said that like rape was a common thing done by the Vikings, which couldn't be further from the truth. Rape was actually punishable by death in the Viking Age. So the penalty for rape was much harsher in the 800s than it is today in modern day Norway. There's another misconception about this culture being backwards and barbaric. Again, very, very untrue. This was a culture that were like the Vikings were trading with Baghdad and Egypt and Constantinople. You know, this was a sophisticated culture of tradesmen and diplomats who had connections to the entire rest of the world, and who ran a trading empire based on the North Sea that spanned the entire European continent and even stretched into what we called Serkland in that time, the Middle East. This was also a culture of extreme poetic ability, so that the Old Norse poetry follows so strong rules of how to compose a poem that most modern day poets are not able to replicate it, you know. As well, it was a very democratic culture where we got centralized authority in the king through Christianity. So like a huge part of the North being Christianized was that it was very good for the people who wanted power to have a religion that sort of excused that sort of total power vested in one person, which Christianity did, like the king was elected by the grace of God. Whereas the Old Norse pagan system was much more democratic, and it was centered around decentralized local governance, where everyone was represented. All of the farmers were represented in these central local governments. So yeah, those are some important misconceptions, that this was not a barbaric, misogynistic culture. This was a very, very highly refined culture with great reverence for religion, for poetry, for diplomacy, and for democracy.
Thank you for that. You've certainly taught me a lot, and I hope that our viewers and listeners have been have learned so much from your explanation just from that alone. And I'm sure there's so much more research that can be done into what the culture was like, in order to dispel these misconceptions and untruths, from just sort of unlearn what we've somehow learnt in our
Yeah, that's
education
very true as
systems.
well, because
Yeah.
Christianity really likes to portray itself as the civilizing force, you know, which just is blatantly untrue in European context, and also naturally in the context of India.
Absolutely. This actually brings me very smoothly into my next question, into education systems. This time, I'd like to ask you, how is Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma taught in your country's school systems, and how is it covered in your media? So there's just sort of two parts to that.
In the media, very little, but that's because Indian people in general don't make a lot of trouble. So there's very, very seldom any reason to talk about the Indian diaspora in Norway. You know, we don't have too many Hindus here either, but it's very rarely portrayed in the media. We have a few mandis, which are beautiful, and we have an Indian community, but there's usually not so much to say about it, namely because there's no great issues with the Indians. Of course, how Sanatana Dharma is taught in the school is very, very, very reductive. The reason for that as well, and here I have to give people some slack, because when you're talking about Sanatana Dharma, you're talking about the oldest surviving religious tradition in the world. What you're able to cover on in the educational system is very limited, just namely because it is so incredibly complex. And that's also something, because a lot of my students, they come to me and they're a bit confused, but like, doesn't this word mean that? Doesn't this deity represent that? But here we're talking about something that has gone through so many transmutations throughout history, and something that is so ancient that like you need an entire life to study it, you know? So even how you approach it, you will need an entire life to study these things. But it's not bad the way it's taught. It's not bad. It's one of the religions we sort of teach best. But it's been ages ago since I studied this in school, so I don't really remember that well how it was.
Well, thanks for that. And well, I do hope that we could see that your education system will see more of a profound study into what Sanatana Dharma is about. And of course, again, with this, there's so much to unpack and to discover, that it can't just simply be taught in a structured timetable of just a few weeks. It's
Yeah,
impossible. It
yeah.
does take a
And what I
lifetime.
hope we'll see as well is the more attention around the connection between the European indigenous tradition and Sanatana Dharma, because that's something I think people would find extremely interesting, and it would also be something that could unite us against the forces of modernity, and that can create, like, bring us back to this sort of like shared identity where New Age people or people interested in some kind of spiritual tradition wouldn't feel that they have to choose between something that is exotic and different and something that is more part of their identity, and rather seeing those similarities. So that's what I really hope for the future, is that more people get aware of these similarities and our shared history.
Absolutely. I would love to see that here as well. So fingers crossed that we'll get to that point. So you talked about the fact that Hinduism and Sanatana Dharma isn't sort of touched upon in your media. But as you yourself are probably very well aware, Hindu Dharma and Sanatanis are frequently maligned in Western media. I'm sure you've seen lots and lots of articles and examples of
Yeah,
that.
and India for that matter. I've seen a lot of that.
Yeah, in
Like,
India.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, Insight have recently released a report outlining Western media's biased coverage of Hindus, Sanatana Dharma, India, Modi ji,
Yeah.
etc. How do you feel about this?
I find that, because like what really gets me going is painting Modi and the BJP and modern day India as a fascist regime. I find it absolutely ridiculous, and especially coming from the forces that colonized that country. So now that you have like a Hindu majority and they're doing their kind of politics, now you're accusing them of fascism. I find it ridiculous. There is no country in the world right now that elevates people out of abject poverty as fast as India. And it was also very fascinating to me, because like the first time I went to India, because people were telling me that like, oh, you need to be careful, you need to be careful. And I was like having this picture in my head of, as soon as I left the airport in Delhi, that I would find this like camels walking around the street and like people without hands and feet coming after me, because people were giving me this image of what India was. And it was like, so couldn't be further from the truth, in terms of like how modern it was, how educated the population was, how everybody spoke like fluent English. And I've been traveling around India loads. I've been walking in the streets in Delhi and another place in the middle of the night, not have had a single problem. And I think it's also very stupid of the Western media to paint India in that picture, because India is also, like, geopolitically our natural allies in this area against, you have China there, you have Pakistan there. They're up to no good between themselves. They're trying to get the water resource in the Himalayas. Like, we should definitely work on our relationship to India before it's too late, because there are a lot of forces there that right now are allying themselves together and against India. And India is the West's most natural ally in that area. Yeah.
100% agree with you there. And thank you so much for that. there needs to be a complete revamp and rehaul in the way that the Western media portrays and covers India, Hindus, Modiji, etc. Now, just sort of delving into a more personal question, have you on yourself on a personal level encountered or have had to undergo Hinduphobia?
No, never.
That's good. That's good. Have others around you who are also Sanatanis, have they also had to face that?
Not to my knowledge. Luckily, no.
Right. If you were to to face it in some capacity, how would you respond to that? It might be a difficult question, but how would you yourself position yourself into being able to counter that?
I don't really know. It's a bit of a hard question because
Mm.
it's a hypothetical scenario. I don't know. I'm not a guy who is very easily offended either. So yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know.
No, that's okay. But it's just that we find so many instances of Hinduphobia and Hinduphobia uh, around the world. And it may
Yeah.
be more concentrated in some places than others, but it is an unfortunate fact of the
Mm.
times. And yes, people are having to undergo to go through this, and it's important that we find ways to be able to dispel misconceptions and untruths about our ways of life and ancient indigenous ways of life. But
Mm.
I'm sure all our viewers will be very happy to know that you haven't faced anything like that, which
Mm.
is really good news. Um, just penultimate question: how do you feel as a non-Indic or non-Indian origin individual? How do you feel when you come across Indic origin people who themselves propagate Hinduphobia and demonstrate a lack of understanding or awareness about their heritage? So coming from
Uh, yeah.
someone as yourself, you've come into this. Well,
Yeah.
I would say you've discovered your affinity to this, and you sort of rediscovered yourself. How do you
Yeah.
feel when someone like myself, for example, or Priyanka ji, is knowingly propagating uh, untruths about Hinduism and Sanatana Dharma in India, Modi, etc.?
I get.
How do you
Yeah.
feel?
Yeah. I guess what do you mean? I haven't encountered any Indian origin people criticizing Modi ji or the BJP, but what I find quite telling in India, several places, especially the places that are very focused on tourism, is that the Western twist and the capitalistic misrepresentation of Indian traditions have been reabsorbed certain places in India, and that makes me really, really sad. That like you've taken, for example, tantra, and you've made it something about like having better orgasms. And there are
Mhm.
places in Goa, there are places in Himachal Pradesh that will teach this Western style to tourists, namely because capitalism is a strong force. You know what I mean? And if you want to make money, you find your ways. But I find to me it's very sad to see when the Indian people and Indian culture becomes too westernized and too modernized, namely because it is like the last vestige of the traditional Indo-European culture we have on this planet at the moment, and it needs to be kept, you know, to be kept intact and protected because it's a treasure that the rest of us can use to find back to our own spiritual identity.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Um, and just final question, ending on a lighter note. You've mentioned that you've traveled extensively throughout India. First of all, what would you say is your favorite place in India? Where has been what is your favorite destination within India? And if possible, where would you like to visit next, or which part of India attracts you the most?
Mm. I absolutely love Himachal Pradesh, the entire area. I think if I had to choose one favorite place, because I have an Indian adopted family, sort of.
Oh,
So I'm very close to a family living up in the Kangra area. So I go to see them. So like when I go to India now, it's mostly to stay with them. But they're Gaddis, so they're part of like a tribe community that lives up there, and the wife of my friend, she is from a small village called in Kareri. So it's like 3,000 meters above skyline in the Himalayas, above the sea in the Himalayas. And it's this little village that you can't drive to it, so you have to like carry your stuff and just walk around along the rice fields with the buffaloes and stuff. And there is no, everything is like wood fired in the village, and I think that village must be my favorite place, just because the drive up there is spectacular, and it's just so serene and beautiful and traditional. But I do love the entire Himachal area a lot, and I'm also like surprisingly a big fan of Delhi, even though it's like extremely chaotic and noisy. But I kind of think that's the fun thing about Delhi as well. There's like it's impossible to plan anything. You just have to go with the flow. Uh, so yeah, I do like Delhi a lot, but I think one favorite place would be Himachal Pradesh around the Kareri Mountains and the Daladar Mountains.
Brilliant. Would you actually are you open to learning more Indian languages? Because we know that you have you are skillful in Sanskrit and Hindi. Are there any other languages that you'd like to learn, to explore? Because we've
It
talked
would
about
have
how
to be,
important languages are.
yeah, it would have to be Gadi, like the local dialect, but it's not a written language, it's a spoken language, just simply because it's fun to communicate with the people. Because like the family I go to visit there, they speak Hindi, but their language is Gadi. So it would have to be Gadi, but I find it like really fascinating as well that it's not a written language. So I can't Google it, I can't find it online. I just have to like hear it and pick up a few words here and there.
Well, we wish you luck in your endeavors of learning more Indian languages. Well, thank you so much, Prajña. That's all we have time for. Thank you so much. And dhanyavad to you for being our very first guest on this new podcast series. We wish you all the best and hope you will come back to see us. And to our viewers as well, dhanyavad. And thank you so much for joining us. And we will see you next time. Take care. Namaste. And I think back to you, Priyanka. Ji.
All right. Yeah,
Statement.
I really wanted to extend my heartfelt gratitude actually for your time and the insight which you have shared and your expertise as well. I mean, it was absolutely informative and truly resonates everyone who will hear this podcast actually. You know, I was truly intrigued by the similarity and strong parallels between various ancient cultures, which you have mentioned actually. I mean, from mentioning to cows to languages and, you know, the small details like use of weapon by the Devs. So, you know, you have actually made effort in learning both the cultures and all kind of ancient faiths. So it's really kind of gave a food for thought. And I completely agree when you say that all these faiths are scientific and we have to use them precisely, which leads to the concept of, you know, as you rightly mentioned, capitalization of spirituality. You know, this thing, you know, shopping for the religion, very rightfully said that without going into in-depth in this fast-changing, fast food generation, as we call them, it's very important to stay connected and go in-depth first before jumping into something else. And obviously,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the Abrahamic religions, which have the idea of victimization as against the original faith system, where we actually naturally feel connected in this complex world. And your other point about yoga and asana, you know, one is for spiritual fitness and other is for physical fitness. But yes, the Western has mixed them together, which is totally different. Yeah, completely agree with them. It was really, really a good insight on listening from your expertise. And again, finally, as you said, that the forces which are colonizing the country, they are sharing the information, and with your experience, you have found out that India is exactly not the same which you had it in your mind earlier. So it's far from what they portray a country as. It's really, and you're coming from you as a first-hand experience, really, really nice. I really thank you once again for being with us and giving this, you know, invaluable contribution to our podcast series. Dhanyavad.
Dhanyavad.
Dhanyavad ji, thank you so much for your wonderful insights.